Good evening, and welcome to the Nautical Nights Autumn Mini-Series in partnership with the Kingston Yacht Club. My name is Doug Cowie, and I'm the manager at the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston. The mission of the museum is to inspire an enduring connection to the maritime history of Kingston and the Great Lakes. We are open to the public down at the Portsmouth Olympic Harbor, and you can follow us on social media. Before we get started, let me draw your attention to the chat function at the bottom of your screen where you can post comments and questions. Or if you prefer, you can send us an email at marmus, that's M-A-R-M-U-S, at marmuseum.ca, M-A-R-M-U-S-E-U-M.ca. If that's too complicated, just Google Marine Museum of the Great Lakes and it will take you to our website. It'll pop up. The Nautical Nights is a speaker series that we usually hold with a live presentation down at the Kingston Yacht Club every 2 weeks, beginning in January and lasting through the winter. We decided to add an autumn mini series to complement the Forged in Fire project the Marine Museum developed in collaboration with the Royal Military College Museum to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of the Battle of the Atlantic and the Second World War, and particularly Kingston's maritime contribution to the war effort. The series recently presented stories of the corvettes built at the Kingston shipyards and stories of extraordinary women and wrens who served during the war. And tonight, in this final presentation of the three, we recognize the life and sacrifices of Canada's sons and daughters through the eyes of former Royal Canadian Naval Reservist Grant MacDonald, as presented by Dr. Michelle Clarabut. Michelle is the Program and Communications Manager at the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes. Before joining the museum, Michelle completed her doctorate in Italian history at Royal Holloway University of London and a Master of Arts in European Studies in 2011 at the University of Guelph, where her PhD thesis was first conceived, and in 2009 graduated from Queen's University with a Bachelor of Arts honors in art history and Italian. Over the course of her academic career, Michelle also taught art history at Royal Holloway, University of London, European cultural history at the University of Guelph, and English in France. Michelle also volunteers with the Kingston Association of Museums as chair of the marketing committee, where she networks regularly with local museums and galleries to develop new engagement opportunities within the community. Over the past couple of years, she has worked on a number of smaller projects, including Kingston Visual History Research, curating an art exhibition on local artist Zena Bernstein, and a pilot project designed to use technology to bring meaningful engagement with arts and culture to residents in long-term care homes. So it is with great pleasure that I now turn this evening presentation over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Doug, for the introduction. Always a little difficult to hear your own introduction being told next door. As you can see, we're both in the museum at the moment. One of us in one end, one in the other. Thank you so much for allowing me to present this evening. I'm very excited about the topic. I hope you'll enjoy looking at the drawings as much as I enjoyed researching them. For those who joined the first two speaker nights, you will now know that this mini-series, as Doug said, is a culmination of the Marine Museum's year commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of the Battle of the Atlantic and the Second World War. The museum's collaborative project, Forged in Fire, was undertaken to provide an opportunity to share Kingston's contribution to the war effort and for members of the public to share their stories or those of loved ones who once served in a maritime capacity or built the ships in Kingston. Our intent with these submissions is for the public to learn about the local individuals who took up the call of duty, who they were, what they did before and after, and when possible, their involvement in the war. I want to thank those who have contributed to this project and let you know that there is still time for you to submit your story via the museum's website. Over the course of the year, the museum has also been sharing photos and stories from its every Saturday on social media. I think some of my favorites are the photos of the Corvette launch days at Kingston shipyards. If you caught any of these posts, you'll know that they were quite the affair. Controlling slides at the same time, so bear with me here. Through Roger Litweiler, we explored the construction of the Kingston-built Flower-class corvettes, along with tales of the men who served on them. I know I was particularly moved by the story of the English and French Canadian vessels coming alongside in the lead up to the D-Day invasion. Then with Sherry Pringle, we heard the stories of several Kingston Wrens, the roles they held, the lives they lived, and the skills they learned. With so much covered on the history, individual stories, and ships, you may very well be wondering, what could I possibly have left to share as it relates to Kingston's maritime contribution? The answer, of course, is art. War artists, particularly in the 20th century, had become a growing part of a country's military, recording battles, life, machinery, and people, capturing the moments and impressions for the purpose of compiling a record of the war. Many of us have seen the black and white photographs and the paintings depicting military engagements, but rarely do we catch a glimpse of the people and the life they lived during their service. Rarer still are the captured accounts by an observer of life at sea. In Kingston, we are fortunate to have been the home of one such artist, and one who also, by way of his post-war life, fits the criteria of the Forged in Fire project. I speak, of course, of Grant MacDonald, a portrait artist who settled in Kingston after the war and built a home on the shores of Lake Ontario. Now, as I know many of you who would be joining this presentation would already be quite familiar with Grant, perhaps having already attended an exhibit of his works, are in possession of one of his books, or were in fact a family friend. I found myself pondering how I might best frame this topic and what other stories I might be able to share with you. I concluded that I might best contribute to the topic through my generational lens. For mere weeks before Grant passed, I was born. I do not have a family connection like some, or attended any exhibits like others, but I do have a family connection to the Canadian Navy's involvement in the war. That means I can relate to its subjects. Works that I had seen in my youth, and more recently, the works I have studied through my work at the Marine Museum, have all made an impression on me. My intent, therefore, is not to provide a biographical overview of his life, well, perhaps only a little, but rather to share the stories I have heard and read about Grant to better understand the artist before exploring some of the drawings that resounded most with me and that are less in circulation. Because while the collection remains in storage and is inaccessible for the moment, it should not mean I cannot take a moment to share in the beauty, the emotion, and the life of the subjects as the museum wraps up its 71st anniversary commemorations. On the 19th of September, 1987, the Globe and Mail printed an article capturing the life of, quote, one of Canada's most successful artists, end quote. Within those lines are a journalist's effort to retell the story of an artist, and this is what I learned. Between 1929 and 1940, he attended various intervals the Ontario College of Art part-time while working for a newspaper, the Art Student League in New York, and Heathley's Art School in London. He painted dominant figures, theatrical figures like Flora Robson, Gladys Cooper, Lawrence Oliver, and Gertrude Lawrence, Stratford Festival actors for the Globe and Mail, they total of 42 works, and celebrities for various newspapers in New York. He was commissioned by King George VI to complete a portrait of Princess Elizabeth and Philip Mountbatten to celebrate their engagement, but sadly returned to Kingston to care for his father in 1953. Between 1941 and 1987, he had 25 one-man exhibitions in Toronto and several across Canada. He built a home and a studio on the shores of Lake Ontario that he named Tarquin. And finally, while he never married, he had one sister who unfortunately passed away some years before he did. In other major papers, I found even less was written for his obituary. Now, I'm sure you will agree that this article presents a rather cold and superficial look at an artist who is quoted so many times as being, what was it? Oh yes, one of Canada's most successful artists. one who took such great care to capture the individual in the subject, going beyond simply drawing their physical characteristics to reveal some of who they are as a person. In reality, it fails to reciprocate, quote, his warm sensitivity towards human relations, end quote. Who was Grant MacDonald? The absence of any immediate family does not mean we have nothing to go by, because Grant's family, I've come to learn, was actually made up of more than one. In Kingston, Grant found a family through his neighbors and colleagues at Queen's University, and thankfully, an exhibit put together by the museum in October of 2010 entitled Master in Our Midst, featuring Grant's portrait collection, provided an opportunity to share stories and through them better capture who Grant was. I would share a couple of them with you to better understand the artist before we explore some of his works. Morgan Fitzpatrick shares the story of running into Grant at a store on Brock Street, where he was inquiring as to the delivery of his furniture. He proceeded to explain that he was waiting urgently for his new chair that he needed for a photography session with Vogue magazine. Morgan proceeded to ask which issue, to which Grant replied, the Halloween issue. A number of stories describe Grant as punctual and detailed. Carolyn Hetherington, in particular, recalls whenever Grant was invited for drinks, he would, quote, arrive on her street early, drive up and down until the appointed hour, and then appear at her door exactly 1 minute early, end quote. Then there is the memory provided by Barry Thorne, a former journalist of Kingston Whig Standard. Barry touches upon several notable qualities when he describes, quote, Grant's urbanity, his intellectual understanding of his own art as well as that of others, and the place of discipline in the enhanced and selective realism he works so hard to produce. For Grant, his art was a way of life, and the qualities of style, taste, and discipline were reflected not only in the painstakingly detailed brushwork of his canvases, but in his home and personal outlook on art and modern life. There is a difference between being still and being dead, he told me, and serenity is a quality I strive for in a painting. So it is natural that the serenity of sleep often pervades my work, end quote. He explained the effect can sometimes be unreal, like movement in a dream. Barry also quotes a comment by Grant relating to his style and technique that I believe you will soon come to understand when I share more of his naval works. He quotes, after minute and detailed observation, my work becomes a subtle distortion of physical reality. I am trying to record in my paintings the results of a particular observation. Grant felt, and I'm sure you will soon agree, he fused, quote, intellectual analysis with warmth of feeling, end quote, in his explorations of personality and human relations. There is also a memory that I received this morning from the Marine Museum's curator emeritus, Marie Smith, who recalls having visited Grant at Tarquin in 1985 while preparing for an upcoming exhibit. I found his description from the morning of the exhibit particularly moving. Maurice wrote, the exhibition was mounted as a point of executive director / curatorial vanity. I took pride in greeting Grant MacDonald and his friend as they approached the museum. He in his mohair coat draped over his shoulders and wearing a wide-brimmed hat, just as I imagined him mounting the steps of the National Gallery in London, in reality, a lean time for him. It caused me to wonder what Grant would think now of the fate of his works and the continued love and respect demonstrated by followers old and new. Further to these anecdotes and conversations, subjects have often described Grant as a humble person, very tall with a gentle and sardonic smile. As formidable, tall with an old-fashioned hairstyle, swept back, and aware of cravats. He was cordial, charismatic, patient, humorous, friendly yet private, a lover of the Beatles, and a collector of books and records, including Duke Ellington records. Together, these accounts provide an explanation for the success of Grant's naval career and the popularity of his drawings. His ability to form meaningful relationships with people, coupled with an eye for detail, are certainly two qualities that set him apart from other wartime artists. For it is certain that while at sea, Grant was far more than the artistic observer, but a part of the crew as he sought to get to know them, understand their stories and experiences. How else might he have captured their lives so personally? This is further supported by George Merrill, an officer on HMCS Restigouche, when Grant came aboard in 1945 to sketch the ship's personnel. He commented on the sketches in a letter to the Marine Museum in 1991. He wrote, "They are tremendously true portraits, not only as regards facial likeness, but the very field of their personality and character. I have done portraits for the past 25 years, and I am on my hands and knees before that talent that brings these men alive after 45 years. So let us take a look at Grant's tenure as a wartime artist, which, while only lasting 3 years, provided one of his largest, totaling over 300 works, and best known collections, and certainly in the eyes of the Marine Museum, some of his best works. His service as a war artist for the Royal Canadian Navy began in 1943 when he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve. By this point, Grant had already made a name for himself as a portrait artist for theater companies and of servicemen and women through his contract with the Montreal Gazette. A review of this exhibit stated, "He sets down what he sees, and knowing that the drawings would come under the most unrelenting critics, officers and men of the forces depicted, he has been meticulous as to the details. And perhaps most importantly, quote, he has the faculty of making a rifle or a gun look like metal. Bayonet and dagger are convincingly steel," end quote. And so when he enlisted, he was soon commissioned by the Royal Canadian Navy's Directorate of Special Services to capture the life, action, and personnel of its sailors. And whether they were ready for him or not, Grant MacDonald transformed a generation's understanding of life at sea. In the foreword of Grant's book, Sailors, published in 1945 by Macmillan, then Vice Admiral, Chief of the Naval Staff, G.C. Jones, had this to write about Grant's work. The cold realism of the camera and the vivid colors of the painter had given the people of Canada in this war a far greater knowledge of the work and objectives of their Navy than they ever had before. It has been left to the pen and pencil of Lieutenant MacDonald to go beyond the realistic and heroic, portray the Canadian sailor as a lad who left his home and went to serve Canada at sea, simply because he felt it was the thing to do. And portray them he did. The drawing that I'm to share with you now, or the drawings rather, rarely hold true to the tradition of, quote, the sailor that is a rollicking, carefree chap, end quote. Instead, the propagandist version of a Canadian sailor is scrapped for the altogether personalized and emotional reality of the men and women who served. The men who filled the ranks of the crew on board came from all over Canada and were of all different ages and ways of life. Through veteran of the Seven Seas, Grant presents leading stoker R. Dimmock, who before joining the RCNVR was with the Merchant Navy. Similarly, Grant has the oldest sailor in the Canadian Navy, as portrayed as Chief Yeoman of Signals Patrick O'Hare. While age and way of life are captured in Sailor from the Prairies. In this last case, young sailor stoker Winston Elliott represents the prairie sailor, some of whom, seeing an opportunity to see the world, became the Canadian Navy's best seamen. And although they had never before seen salt water, on sea duty, they had measured up to some of the best the maritime provinces had to offer. And of course, future recruits could be found in the ranks of the Navy League of Canada, which sponsored 88 corps, 15,000 cadets throughout the Dominion. The League taught the principles of seamanship and naval training at onshore establishments in preparation for their expected eventual enlistment in the Royal Canadian Navy. Depicted here is what Grant captions "Baby of the Navy," picturing the young man who most likely has not long left as a cadet in contemplation, perhaps thinking about his older brothers he hopes someday to join. The training, while perhaps not covering the hands-on training sailors encountered at sea, nevertheless taught the cadets valuable skills, often using converted yachts for the training, as pictured here in Grant's sketch, Sea Cadets Hoist Lifeboat Inboard. And in the photographs housed in the museum's collection, depicting various drills the cadets would have had to undergone. The training these cadets undertook would certainly prepare them for a number of jobs, tours, and experiences in the Navy, including Dobie Day, or Laundry Day to the sailor, Dobie meaning launder in East Indian, and that was something that apparently the sailors took a liking to. While conditions were not always favorable like in the North Atlantic, it seems leading seaman J.A. Hill was fortunate to catch a fair day for his washing and drying. Further evidence of a warm day is also visible in the bared upper half, his shirt hanging on the line to the left with a pair of socks in the back. The only thing remaining being the kerchief around his neck. With make and mend, here we have ordinary seaman F.J. Kushner sewing on a button during the period in which a sailor is left to his own devices. But with the unspoken expectation, he would spend it washing and mending his clothes. Or even semaphore, where ordinary telegraphist Bonham is sending a message by semaphore, a tried and true method unobscured by others of more recent and scientific invention. I particularly like here the realistic tilt of the drawing. Rather than presenting face on with a vertical line, Grant imbues realism by placing the subject at a slight angle. However, as much as their cadet training could instill discipline, efficiency, and skills to the young cadets, life at sea was far from glamorous. One perhaps wonders where the notion of the traditional sailor was dreamt up. The stories recounted by Roger and Shaw describe a harsher reality, a test of the strength of individual character and the impact it could have on the individual who chose to take up the call of duty. Petty Officer Torpedo Gunner's mate, J.J. Heath, is, quote, sketched under the glare of the escape hatch in the mess deck of a submarine, end quote. The sheer conditions of serving aboard a submarine are, in the eyes of the unexperienced, perhaps too daunting to overcome. But in the portrait of Petty Officer Heath, we see the resounding acceptance of these conditions. While the lighting certainly provides the reality of the context, Grant's attention to detail and familiarity with the human form and spirit captures the harshness of the job at hand and the heavy toll it's had on the sailor. The pictured expression and stance of Heath leads one to believe he is every inch the seasoned sailor. And while perhaps not always happy he chose the job, he's truly proud for having done so in a modest sort of way. Visual signaling had many advantages over the traditional semaphore at sea, especially when long distances or weather conditions interfere. Here, signalman C.A. Breather is pictured in contrast to P.O. Heath, in action rather than posed, as he undertakes his responsibilities. But I would ask that we pause here and focus on the portrait of Breather. The beauty of art is that it is subjective, so we have differing opinions. But I believe at least some of you will agree that Grant has captured here an important change that many a sailor would have undergone. In Breather's eyes, Grant captures both youth, the hint of hope and excitement, while also evoking a sense of the eyes that have seen too much. There is a sense that Breather in his young life has already experienced some of the horrors of war and supreme exhaustion that come with serving in the In this drawing, Grant provides a very realistic look at the working sailor at sea, most likely in the North Atlantic. Grant's description of the drawing reads, quote, the navigating officer, Lieutenant L. Wallace, is plotting a course in the chart of a Canadian corvette under the difficult conditions during a blow, while ordinary seaman, R.L. Ritzie, awaits messenger duties, end quote. The conditions are evident in everything from the thick glove on the bottom left and the heavy coat worn by Lieutenant Wallace, who leans over the desk to chart the course, suggesting he needs to steady himself and his equipment. To Ritzie, who waits patiently behind him while taking the opportunity to warm his hands. And let's not forget Grant's subtle addition of the hook behind Ritzie's left shoulder that hangs out from the wall. We should be able to just make out the shadow. There. And as if these clues aren't enough, Grant draws the entire subject once again on an angle. These sketches so far reveal the responsibilities and jobs undertaken by our Canadian sailors, but there is yet another experience that has marked its toll. Many of us are fortunate to have never known the conditions of war or the incredible emotional toll one would have faced of being part of the crew of a stricken vessel. Grant captures here the rescued crew of one such ship who are given blankets and a hot drink, a staple of rescue missions. The faces are more difficult to make out in this and the next drawing, so I expect that the subject may have more widely been to encompass the experience rather than the individual. The survivors huddle together for warmth and bond over the shared experience, while a member of the crew hands out offerings of the hot drink. You can see him just entering from the right side of the drawing. I am perhaps most drawn to the young fellow on the far left, who sits with his leg up and his lip out while deep in thought. And the fellow in the middle of the back of the first drawing, who pauses with a cup to his mouth and looks over as if to say, "You could never know." What immediately comes to mind is a story submitted through the Forge and Fire Project by the grandson, thank you, Kevin, of ordinary seaman Leonard Offord, who joined at HMCS Cataraqui and served throughout the war on corvettes, HMCS Mayflower being the longest. Kevin Offord recounts an experience I expect many of you have encountered, of the descendants seeking to know more about their ancestors' service and their experiences during the war, and of the veteran not yet, perhaps never able to speak of the life they lived. While Offord was never able to share his story, his service is captured by Grant. In his sketch, Offord carries a tray of hot food and drink while attempting to keep his balance, on which was surely a rough sea. He is most certainly a far cry from the young sailor Spinney, E.J. Pratt's poem, Behind the Log, who not quite 6 months at sea was still having difficulty bringing his officer a full and seawater-free mug of key back from the galley. In the case of Grant's sketch, boots Offord wears, large rubber ones by the looks, suggest that he was either in from the storm outside or working below deck where deck shoes would no longer be appropriate. And in true Grant fashion, we also get a sense of the thoughts and going through Offord's mind, his determination to complete the assigned task, which combined with his clear ability to withstand the rocking of the ship, suggests that by this point he is a seasoned sailor. Before I move on to what is perhaps one of my favorite drawings, it would be unfair of my female predecessors to leave out some of the few drawings we have by Grant of wrens. As we know from Sherry Pringle's presentation, women of the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve were involved in all sorts of jobs throughout the year of the war, taking up the naval trades to allow men to be restationed at sea. The portrait that generally comes to mind is that of Joan Boyd, née Jeffrey. For those that missed Sherry's presentation, Joan was from Midland, Ontario, and worked at her father's hardware store before joining the Navy. Her regular training lasted a month, and as she was to be a motor transport driver, it then took her on a 6-month course to Galt, Ontario. Life as a wren took Joan across the ocean to Scotland and England, where she apparently got a speeding ticket in Greenock, Scotland for racing big lorries. But before she took to the British roads, Joan was assigned to Ottawa, where she drove staff cars for naval officers. It was on one of these drives that a naval officer claimed she looked like a typical, or rather stereotypical, wren, and brought her to see Grant MacDonald, who proceeded to draw her portrait over the course of the week she was his driver. However, what I find most remarkable about this story is that she apparently never saw the completed work until 46 years later. She was 22 at the time it was drawn, when she happened to pick up a card from the Marine Museum, which had started the fundraising campaign that succeeded in keeping Grant's naval collection together. Joan was on the cover of it. Taking a look at the responsibilities of probationary wrens, Grant includes a drawing of the gash wagon, for which the description reads, quote, "Wrens during their probationary period, which includes, among other duties, collecting refuse and gash wagons, have sometimes felt good-naturedly that girls in this war are replacing horses rather than men." Now, I expect Grant, being Grant, actually captured the seemingly happy subject rather than viewing the image with misconstrued emotions. The girls behind our sailor boys is an interesting subject. The description identified the three women as Wren photographer Margaret Northrop, Wren Josephine Gadsby, and leading Wren Blanche Hayes. I leave you to make your own identification argument. But if we are to identify them from left to right in the order they are listed, then Wren on the right will be leading Wren Hayes. Now, I expect many of them felt overwhelmed or strained at times during their service, so I'm inclined to believe my identification for the simple reason that Wren on the right appears to have the weight of 1,000 responsibilities on her shoulders. I could certainly be wrong, she's only listening to her colleague, but the set of her eyes and body lead one to believe that she has passed the point of listening and is now going over a number of things. Conscious of time and the realization that I could go on for hours about this, I did say there were over 300. I would turn now to the drawing shared with me a couple of weeks ago. When I first saw the drawing, there was no description to go along with it. And so to start, I would like for you to experience the same. Now, for those of you who know it well, please hold your comments for a minute. Recalling what I mentioned about the beauty of art, I asked you to think about the image Grant has presented here. Who do you think is pictured? What is he capturing? And what emotions does it evoke? My first impression of this drawing was one of emotion, perhaps because my mind went first to symbolism. I was struck by the significance of the young man in a uniform too big, the overcoat sleeves and pant legs too long, the hat too big, and the boots too large. Behind him stands an unidentified officer with a similar uniform, whose face is deliberately cut off. Just make out the top of the drawing. It shows the cutoff of the officer in the background. With eyes bright and mouth slightly open in expectation, Grant calls to mind the thousands of young boys who follow the sound of the bosun's pipe to seas unknown, and who would return home a man not yet known. Upon discovering Grant's description of sailors, I was caught off guard, but soon found that my own interpretation had some merit. Grant wrote, quote, "In the tradition of the Navy, on Christmas Day, the youngest rating officer takes over command of the ship, donning the captain's complete uniform and fulfilling some of his duties, while the executive officer hovers in the background to redirect any mistakes. In Captain for a Day, this honor fell to Stoker, second class, Charles Ulch. Grant captures here the events of that day. And I believe Grant, in the way that only an artist can, also evokes far more than the subject that he depicts. Through his own unique style and ability to capture the soul of his subjects, Grant reminds us that for so many of these young sailors, uniform always began too big. But for those fortunate few, they would grow into those shoulders and boots and become the purposefully not quite distinguishable figure in the background. The Navy seen through Grant's eyes could never be said to be glorified. Our image of the traditional carefree sailor is now well and truly gone. And in its place is not one, but many different types of sailors. Each of their experiences carving out a new reality, sharing only in their choice to serve. Grant MacDonald holds true to his subjects, capturing their character and life. I admire in particular his choice to, in his own way, demonstrate the strength of women in the Navy, for which I share this last drawing. The request depicts the daunting prospect of following procedure and making a request of an officer. The young Wren, while missing her cap, stands strong in the face of her officers, with their bulging eyes, stern chins, and squared shoulders. This moment could have equally been depicted by a young male sailor, but the use of a woman reinforces my belief that Grant was perhaps also an advocate for women's rights. But that is the subject for another day. Referring back to my generational lens I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I would reassure those who came before me that the significance of Grant MacDonald's work is not at all lost on myself, and I'm sure on others of my generation. As we move further into the future with commemorations increasing in number, and the knowledge of the Second World War is passed on through textbooks and oral histories, I believe that through the works of Grant MacDonald, we will forever be connected to the harsh realities, joys, and sacrifices of our veterans faced. They cannot and should not be left to the past, but shared with future generations. And so, my parting words to you are words of action. Share these works, share these stories, as I know I will, with those who come after us to ensure that we truly never forget. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. We have time for some questions if anybody has any. I don't see any at the moment. Question from Jay Cunningham. Are all these original works or from the book?
So the photos that I used are from the book, simply because at the moment our collection of Grant MacDonald works, not many of them have been digitized at this point. And so they're a bit, as I said, they're a bit inaccessible, especially given due to COVID, it makes them even more accessible. So I was very thankful to be able to find the Book of Sailors, to be able to capture some of these images and share them with you. But they're certainly all part of the larger
collection. Here's one from Pete Clarabut. The wrens in the request is holding her cap as a requestman would.
Let me go back to it. I'm going to pull up the image again for you guys. You're quite right. Her cap is in her hand at the back, almost blended out by the rest of her uniform. Thank you very much to Pete Clarabut.
And another question, what would the size of the original sketches be, and are they charcoal on paper?
Great question. So the sketches vary in size. They're typically not super large from what I've seen of the scanned photos. The originals that I have seen are actually the larger self-portrait of Grant. They're not massive, I would say, certainly to be able to fit into a sketchbook. For instance, I have sailors in front of me here. In terms of the material that he used, it was largely watercolor paper, but he was using pencil, some pen, I believe it probably a couple of instances charcoal, and I think on occasion also using a bit of oil paint to in some of his drawings to look, I would say, thinking of the survivors ones that apparently he would use oil paint and use his finger to move the paint around and create the effect. And I greatly look forward to the day that we can put all these images and works by Grant back on display at the museum.
I have a question, Michelle. What year did Grant MacDonald die?
ready to put an age on my. He passed away in 1987.
Okay.
A couple weeks before I was born. A couple weeks after I was born.
And where are the originals on display? This is a trick.
Unfortunately, unless there are copies of the naval drawings elsewhere, none of them are on display at the moment. They are, because of current location in the museum, they're actually currently being housed at the RMC Museum, who are very graciously taking care of them for us. When we move back, I imagine one of our plans will be to find a space, public-facing space for these drawings, so that the public can come back and see them in person.
So all the images we saw tonight are actually from the Marine Museum Grant MacDonald collection, correct?
Mhm.
Yeah. I don't know if some people remember back around 2010 or so, maybe it was 2009, Tony Houghton and Chris West, our board chair, also assembled a group of portraits that were in the homes of residents in Kingston that were personal portraits of family members and so forth. And they put on a spectacular exhibition down at the Marine Museum that we had down there for several months out of these private collections. And they had a whole unique style to them and everything that was really interesting, I remember. And I'd like to see that happen again someday, because that was really unique to see the two of them side by side.
I think bringing those theater portraits as well will be bring them all back together.
Really, it would be great.
2027.
I think that's it for questions that I see. Thanks, Michelle, for such an insightful presentation, and also to help promote the works of such an important local artist in the Grant MacDonald collection. We would like to get these images on display again when we get back to our Kingston Dry Dock site at 55 Ontario Street. Thank you all for attending tonight's presentation. You can find details of our winter 2021 Nautical Night speaker series beginning on January 13th. Our first speaker will be Jonathan Moore of Parks Canada. You might remember he visited us several years back and did a beautiful presentation on the Franklin expedition. But now he's going to be making a presentation on the local shipwreck historic sites that have been declared historic sites at his initiation. The schedule is now available on our website, and registration will once again be required with a $5 advance ticket price. But this time we're going to be offering 7 tickets for 6 if you want to, for the price of 6 if you want to watch the whole series. Links to the events will be sent out the day of the event as usual. Thank you also for all the additional donations that people have given us in addition to the $5 ticket price. Thank you very much. And stay well, good night, and good luck.
Bye. Thank you. All right.